My name is Kelsey Donovan, and this is the day I turned humiliation into a weapon. My younger sister stole my fiancé, took my wedding date, and even copied my venue style. As if that wasn't enough, she mailed me an invitation with a handwritten note across the bottom. Come see what true love looks like. Everyone expected me to stay home and cry, or show up broken and pathetic, hiding in the back row. Instead, I walked straight through the main doors in a white dress. Not cream, not champagne. Pure white. The room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence, glasses stopped halfway to lips, and every pair of eyes locked on the ex, who had no business being there, especially not dressed like a bride. I didn't hurry. I let every step land slowly on the aisle runner they'd picked out together, the same style I'd chosen months before. I could feel the shock, the judgment, the whispered questions burning into my back. I didn't care. My hands were steady around the small wooden box I carried, the box nobody knew about, the box that could rip this perfect day apart from the inside. I took my seat and waited. I watched my sister bask in the attention, watched my former fiancé pretend he wasn't terrified to see me sitting there. They thought they had already won, that all I could do was watch them say the vows that were supposed to be mine. Then the ceremony reached that one sentence. The officiant asked if anyone objected. The air tightened. No one moved. I stood up. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. I grew up in a house where being the older daughter meant being the built-in safety net. My parents ran Donovan Health Solutions long before it became a recognizable name in Seattle's tech world, and from the moment I was old enough to hold a laptop, they expected me to help keep things running. While most kids spent their weekends at soccer tournaments or birthday parties, I spent mine watching my dad troubleshoot code while my mom drafted investor pitches at the kitchen table. No one ever asked if I wanted to follow them into the business. It was simply understood. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the daughter they didn't have to worry about. And because they never had to worry about me, they didn't pay much attention to me either. My sister was the opposite. Aubrey drifted through school on charm alone, and my parents treated that charm like it was some rare gift. She was the Donovan image, the one they always pushed into photos and meetings even when she contributed nothing. I told myself it didn't matter. I had the work ethic. I had the discipline. Those things would carry me further than a pretty smile ever could. It almost felt true when I landed my first real position inside the company. I worked directly under our operations division, and for the first time, I felt like everything I'd done was paying off. I was building something meaningful, something tied to more than last names and reputation. That's when I met Evan. He wasn't part of the family business. He came from a mid-sized software firm that collaborated with us on a compliance update. He was sharp, direct, and ambitious in a way that didn't feel performative. He didn't know anything about the Donovan hierarchy or the silent expectations that ruled our household, and that alone made him feel like a breath of clean air. He paid attention to my work, to my ideas, to me. Not because my last name carried weight, but because he actually saw value in what I brought to the table. For someone who'd spent her entire life standing behind louder people, that kind of recognition felt dangerous, like stepping close to an edge and realizing you didn't fear the height anymore. We grew quickly, not recklessly, just naturally. Dinners after meetings turned into late-night walks around South Lake Union, talking about everything except work. He made plans and asked about mine. He talked about building a life, not a brand. When he proposed, I said yes without hesitation. My parents congratulated me in a tone that felt more like checking off a box than celebrating, but I didn't care. I finally had something that was mine, untouched by the family dynamic I'd been orbiting my whole life. For a while, the future felt clear. A house just outside the city, shared projects, a wedding no one could ruin. I thought I had finally stepped into a part of life that didn't require sacrifice. I should have known peace never lasts long in my family. It started with a message from Aubrey about coming home for a while. She'd been living in Los Angeles chasing a content creation career that never became anything. I didn't think much of it. She came home often, usually to hide after one of her ventures collapsed. But the day she walked back into the office, smiling like she owned the place, I felt something shift. My parents rushed to greet her, pulling her straight into meetings she didn't understand, giving her responsibilities I'd been handling for years. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself she'd leave again once she got bored. I didn't realize she was about to stay long enough to crack my entire life open. Aubrey didn't ease her way back into the family or the business. She walked in like she'd never left, like Los Angeles hadn't chewed her up and spit her out. Overnight, my parents rewrote her story from failed influencer to undiscovered creative asset. They gave her an office on the same floor as mine, introduced her to department heads, and acted like she possessed strategic insight instead of a history of unfinished projects. At first, I tried to stay neutral. I'd survived years of being overshadowed, so one more return of the prodigal daughter shouldn't have rattled me. But this time was different. This time, the stakes were tied to everything I had spent years building. The first red flag came during a development review I'd led for months. I had my notes ready, projected timelines, budgets, everything. But before I could start, my mother announced that Aubrey would be co-leading the branding component, a role she created on the spot. Aubrey smiled like she'd been planning it for weeks. The room pivoted to her, and I felt myself fading into the background of my own work. It didn't stop there. Aubrey inserted herself into cross-functional meetings with no understanding of compliance or health data regulations. She made vague suggestions, repeated points she barely grasped, and still somehow received praise for fresh perspective. Every time I corrected one of her inaccuracies, my parents acted like I was undermining her confidence instead of protecting the company. Evan noticed the shift too, or at least he pretended to. He'd stop by my desk, ask how I was holding up, offer a sympathetic look. But he never actually stepped in. He never told my parents they were destabilizing the team or that Aubrey's presence created friction. He simply observed from a distance, like he was studying a problem rather than being part of it. Then the accidental run-ins started. Aubrey would appear near our workspace at random times, laughing too loudly at something Evan said or leaning over his laptop as if they were collaborating. They weren't. She didn't understand a line of what he was working on, but she understood attention, and Evan didn't seem to mind giving her some. I told myself not to overthink it. I told myself proximity doesn't equal interest. But each day, their conversations got longer, their smiles more familiar. My parents only fueled it by calling them the future of Donovan Health's image and innovation, a phrase that hit harder than they realized. The moment things shifted from irritating to alarming came during a late evening in the office. I'd stayed behind to finalize a compliance report. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper. As I passed one of the conference rooms, I heard voices. Low, too close, too soft. I didn't see anything inappropriate, but I saw enough. Aubrey sitting on the table, Evan leaning against the wall, both of them smiling with a kind of ease I'd never seen between them before. They froze when they noticed me. Aubrey hopped down, smoothing her hair in that habitual way she used when she wanted to appear innocent. Evan straightened, avoiding my eyes. They acted like nothing happened. Maybe nothing had. But the shift was clear. There was an intimacy there. Unspoken, unacknowledged, but real. After that night, the distance between Evan and me grew without any dramatic fight or conversation. He became guarded, distracted, always busy. Aubrey became bolder, appearing in his orbit with an entitlement she never bothered hiding. And for the first time, I felt something I'd never felt in my own family's company, like I was being quietly replaced. The unraveling didn't happen in one dramatic blow. It came in small fractures, missed calls, half-finished conversations, excuses that sounded rehearsed. Evan started working late, though his deadlines hadn't changed. Aubrey stayed at the office after hours, too, claiming she was learning the ropes. My parents applauded her dedication. I felt something tightening around me, a quiet pressure I couldn't name, but it was there every time I walked into a room and saw their eyes shift, their postures stiffen. I told myself I was imagining it. Stress, fatigue, too many responsibilities. Anything but the truth forming right in front of me. One evening, after another long meeting where Aubrey tried to pitch an idea she didn't understand, I headed home earlier than usual. Evan said he'd be home late. Again. I didn't question it. But halfway to my apartment, I realized I'd left an external drive on my desk. It contained sensitive files I couldn't risk keeping unsecured. I turned the car around. The office should have been empty. Lights off. Doors locked. But when I stepped off the elevator, one conference room glowed faintly from under the door, the same room I'd caught them in weeks earlier. I walked closer, not quietly, not secretly, just moving on instinct, as if I already knew what waited for me. The door wasn't fully shut. Voices slipped through the gap. Soft, close, too close. I pushed it open. Aubrey was leaning against the table, her posture relaxed, familiar, like she belonged there. Evan stood inches from her, facing her, not startled by my entrance. More irritated, like I'd interrupted something private. Their expressions didn't show guilt. They showed annoyance. Annoyance that I'd walked in on a moment they couldn't explain away this time. There was no yelling, no confrontation. They didn't need to say anything. I saw everything I needed to see in the way they looked at me, not with surprise, but with the quiet confidence of people who had already crossed a line long before this moment. I left without speaking, not because I was calm, but because I had no words left. The drive home blurred into one long, ringing silence, the kind that settles in your chest and stays there. The next morning, Evan didn't apologize. He didn't chase me. He didn't even try to lie. He just said we weren't working, a line people say when they've already moved on and want you to accept it without causing a scene. My parents heard about the breakup within hours. They acted concerned for exactly 5 minutes before pivoting. Maybe it was for the best. Maybe we wanted different things. Maybe this would give Aubrey space to shine at the company. They never asked why it ended. Maybe they already knew. I cut contact with both of them, the only act of self-preservation I could manage. I focused on work, avoided family dinners, ignored my mother's passive-aggressive messages about keeping unity. I didn't expect anything else to happen. I thought the damage was done. Then the envelope arrived. It was thick, expensive, sealed with gold foil embossed with their initials. I stared at it for a full minute before opening it, half expecting it to be a joke, or a mistake, or anything other than what it truly was. A wedding invitation. Aubrey and Evan. And at the bottom, in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere, "Come see what true love looks like." No explanation, no remorse, just a taunt, dressed as grace. My parents didn't defend me. They didn't comfort me. They asked if I planned to attend, because it would look bad if you don't show up. Their concern was never about me. It was about optics, reputation, public image. The same priorities that had shaped our entire lives. That was the first moment I realized something. They weren't just willing to let this happen. They expected me to play along. The invitation sat on my counter for days, a reminder of how easily people could rewrite my life without asking. Every time I walked past it, I felt the same mix of anger and disbelief. I wasn't just being replaced, I was being humiliated publicly, and my family wanted me to help them do it. I avoided them for a week, ignoring messages about fittings, rehearsals, and a seating chart I apparently needed to approve. I thought the worst part of this story had already hit me. I was wrong. One afternoon, while I was trying to focus on a system audit, an unknown number called. Normally, I let those go to voicemail, but something about the area code, local, central Seattle, made me answer. The man on the line introduced himself calmly, as if we'd spoken before. He said he represented someone tied to my family, someone whose decisions still carried weight inside Donovan Health. My grandmother, Marion Donovan. The founder, the architect of everything, the only person in our family who had ever seen me, not just my usefulness. She had passed months earlier, leaving behind a legacy of innovation, discipline, and strict standards for anyone who touched the company's future. I thought all her affairs had been settled. Apparently, they hadn't. The lawyer asked me to come in that same afternoon. His tone wasn't dramatic, but it had an urgency that kept me from saying no. His office overlooked Lake Union, a clean, quiet space that felt miles away from the chaos my family had created. He greeted me with a folder already in hand. No small talk, no condolences, just the same efficiency my grandmother had lived by. He told me she'd updated her estate plan during the year before her health declined. The final portion wasn't meant for the entire family. It was meant for one person. Me. I didn't understand why until he explained the rest. Marion had watched our family dynamic shift for years. She saw the growing entitlement, the shortcuts, the disregard for ethics. She saw how my parents pushed appearances over substance, how they overlooked the person doing the real work. She'd anticipated conflict, not the personal drama between siblings, but the professional fallout that could destroy the company she'd built, so she set conditions. Not emotional ones, legal ones. The company's majority control would transfer to a single successor. Only one. And that successor had to meet strict requirements, a clean personal and financial history, a proven record of contribution to the company, and absolutely no association, romantic, professional, or financial, with anyone facing active investigation, outstanding debt, or prior ethics warnings in the tech sector. He then slid the folder toward me. Inside was documentation I'd never seen. Aubrey's mishandled PR contracts, unauthorized spending charged to the company's accounts, evidence she'd removed negative analytics from a past campaign to make herself look competent. And then there was Evan. His file was thicker. A previously flagged breach during an internship. Multiple warnings from past employers for manipulating system permissions. A payment dispute tied to an abandoned project. Unreported debt tied to a failed side business. Every page tightened something in my chest. Not because he had flaws, everyone does, but because he had hidden them from me while positioning himself for a future I thought we'd share. The lawyer told me the documents were authenticated, notarized, and time-stamped long before my breakup. My grandmother hadn't known specifics, but she'd suspected the wrong people could gain influence through personal relationships. And she'd prepared for it. The box he handed me wasn't ceremonial. It was small, wooden, plain. But inside it were the pieces of leverage she believed I might one day need. Not to hurt anyone, but to protect myself, and the company, from exactly what was happening now. I walked out of that office understanding something I hadn't let myself admit before. Aubrey and Evan weren't just reckless, they were liabilities. And my grandmother had left me the tools to expose them, if I chose to use them. I didn't know yet how the wedding would unfold, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't walking into that ceremony unarmed. Walking into that venue felt like stepping onto a stage everyone assumed I'd never stand on again. The sky was gray the way it often is in Seattle, but inside the glass-walled hall everything looked polished, Expensive flowers, curated lighting, a crowd filled with people who loved a performance more than they loved the truth. Perfect for my sister. Perfect for the man who had thrown away our future without a second thought. I arrived exactly on time, not a minute early, not a minute late. Enough to make a statement without saying a word. The wooden box stayed tucked under my arm, light but powerful. The kind of weight that comes from what it represents, rather than what it contains. The second I stepped through the doors, conversation stalled. I didn't need to look around to know people were staring. Some recognized me immediately. Others whispered to confirm whether I truly was the ex-fiancé walking into a wedding she had every reason to avoid. Their reactions didn't bother me. Let them talk. Let them watch. That was the point. Aubrey saw me first. Her smile froze mid-pose as the photographer circled her like she was the centerpiece of the entire city. She blinked, confused at the dress I wore, confused at my posture, confused that I wasn't breaking. Evan stiffened beside her, the kind of stiffness people get when the past they tried to bury shows up dressed in white. I didn't give either of them anything, not eye contact, not emotion, just presence. I took a seat near the aisle, close enough to be seen but far enough to remain unpredictable. You could feel the discomfort ripple through the rows. Guests exchanged looks, trying to figure out whether this was some twisted display of forgiveness or a disaster about to unfold. I kept my hands resting on the box, steady. The lid was closed, but in my mind it was already open. Everything felt stretched thin, like the air was waiting to snap. The ceremony started with the kind of confidence only two people who live in denial can manage. Aubrey floated down the aisle as if her entire life hadn't been built on shortcuts. Evan stood there pretending the past didn't exist. My parents avoided looking at me entirely, focused instead on keeping the performance intact. If one camera caught even a hint of tension, Aubrey's entire brand of the week would collapse. The officiant moved through the script, delivering the standard lines about commitment, honesty, trust, words that would have been ironic if they weren't so pathetic. I felt neither anger nor sadness, just clarity. That calm before impact. Then the moment came. Does anyone here have a reason why these two should not be joined in marriage? Silence washed over the room, heavy and expectant. For a second I waited, not for doubt, but for timing. Every eye shifted subtly toward me, even if people tried to pretend they weren't looking. They knew. They just didn't know how much. I stood. The motion cracked through the space like thunder. Chairs shifted. Gasps followed. Aubrey's face drained of color, the first honest emotion she had shown all day. Evan's jaw clenched, a silent admission that he'd feared this exact moment. I walked toward the front, not rushing, not hesitating, letting the tension build exactly the way my grandmother would have wanted, with precision, with control, with purpose. The officiant looked startled but stayed still as I approached him. I extended the box. He took it carefully, unsure, turning it in his hands as though opening it might change the air around us. The lawyer stepped forward from the side aisle a second later, invited by no one, expected by me alone. His presence wiped whatever composure remained from my parents' faces. He opened the lid. Inside were documents organized so meticulously they commanded respect even before being explained. Compliance reports, financial warnings, flagged incidents, notarized statements, every piece cross-referenced and authenticated. The kind of evidence that didn't create questions but answered them brutally. The lawyer spoke clearly, addressing the officiant and the nearest guests. He explained that the company's founder, my grandmother, had left a set of legal conditions tied to leadership succession. Conditions Aubrey no longer met. Conditions Evan had violated years before he ever met me. Conditions triggered the moment this wedding became official. A wave of whispers erupted. Some guests looked horrified, others fascinated. My parents looked nauseated, caught between shock and the sinking realization that they had backed the wrong people so publicly it might cost them everything. Aubrey's expression twisted. Fear, rage, disbelief, all tangled into something unrecognizable. Evan didn't speak, but the tightening in his shoulders said enough. He knew those documents were real. He knew exactly what they meant for him, for her, for their entire future. The officiant closed the box with a slow, uncertain motion. The lawyer handed him an envelope with the legal citations. The ceremony couldn't continue. Not legally, not socially, not morally. I didn't wait for reactions. I didn't need them. Because in that moment, when truth finally outweighed performance, I realized something important. I hadn't come to stop a wedding. I had come to end a pattern. And I had done exactly that. The moment the ceremony collapsed, everything moved fast in a way that felt almost slow to me. Shock tends to stretch time like that. Guests scattered into groups, some whispering, some filming, some pretending they weren't thrilled to witness a public implosion. I simply stepped aside, letting the chaos unfold the way gravity intended. Aubrey was the first to break. She rushed toward her mother, dragging the hem of her gown, demanding someone fix this, like the world still worked the way she imagined. Evan stayed rooted near the altar, staring at the documents as if trying to convince himself they weren't real. My parents tried to gather themselves, but panic had already seeped into every movement they made. They understood the weight of what had just been exposed. They also understood it wasn't going away. I left the main hall, walking toward a quiet corner near the reception area, where the noise softened into a distant hum. I needed the space, not to breathe, but to watch the collapse from a distance. There's a difference between revenge and accountability. What happened today wasn't revenge, it was overdue clarity. Security arrived not long after, summoned by the venue staff who understood that an event this disrupted needed structure before it spiraled further. They weren't aggressive, just present, ready to intervene if anyone became unreasonable. In other words, they were there for Aubrey. The lawyer who'd stepped forward during the ceremony approached me with a nod, confirming that the documents were now officially in the officiant's hands and that the compliance board would proceed with their review. I didn't need details. I already knew the outcome. The legal violations Evan had accumulated in secret were enough to disqualify him from any corporate role the moment they were authenticated. Aubrey's participation in concealing them sealed her fate. What neither of them seemed to understand was this. Corporations in the U.S. don't gamble with their leadership. Liability kills companies faster than scandal. A person can cry their way out of public embarrassment, but they can't cry their way out of formal filings. From where I stood, I could see the wedding decor glowing softly under the venue lights. Everything had been arranged to look effortless, a perfect illusion. The irony was almost poetic. They wanted a spectacle, and they got one. Just not the kind they planned. After a while, the lawyer signaled that it was time to leave. Not because I was required to, but because staying longer served no purpose. My part was done. The process was in motion. The consequences were theirs now, not mine. When I stepped outside, the evening air was cold enough to make the skin on my arms tighten. I didn't mind. Seattle cold has a way of keeping people honest. I walked to my car without looking back. Closure doesn't always need a final confrontation. Sometimes walking away is the confrontation. But the fallout didn't end at the venue. By the next morning, the board had already filed their notice with the corporation's internal audit department. Evan was suspended pending further review. His credentials would be examined, his activities scrutinized, his affiliations checked for conflict. These weren't punishments. They were procedures. That made them even harder to escape. Aubrey's situation wasn't any better. The moment it became clear she'd been aware of the financial inconsistencies and had chosen to proceed, her eligibility for any leadership consideration vanished. Inheritance expectations? Gone. influence within the family's business circles? Gone. She had tied her future to someone whose foundation was unstable, and unstable things eventually break. My parents reached out, but the space between us was no longer emotional, it was structural. The kind of distance built over years, not hours. They tried to soften their voices, tried to frame everything as a misunderstanding, but I didn't step back into the role I had played my entire life, a role that required shrinking myself so others could feel comfortable. I answered briefly, kept the boundaries firm, and ended the call before old habits tried to resurface. People love to romanticize forgiveness as if it's required for healing. It isn't. Accountability is. And accountability is exactly what unfolded in the weeks that followed. Evan resigned before his disciplinary hearing. A quiet resignation, the kind that avoids formal termination but doesn't erase the mark it leaves behind. Companies talk. Networks talk louder. A resignation during an audit isn't a bruise. It's a scar. Aubrey lost a sponsorship within days. Brands dislike unpredictability. When public trust cracks, contracts follow. She went silent online, something she hadn't done in years. Silence was the closest thing she'd ever come to reality. My parents were left to navigate a world they'd built around image without the illusion that once protected them. They weren't hostile, but they kept their distance. Maybe out of embarrassment, maybe out of shame, maybe because they finally understood I wasn't playing the role they'd assigned me anymore. As for me, life didn't transform overnight. It just shifted into something stable, something mine. I didn't chase reconciliation. I didn't chase applause. I didn't chase closure. I let distance settle where it belonged. I let consequences land where they should. Walking away wasn't an ending. It was finally a beginning. Not for us, as a family. For me, as a person they no longer controlled.